Welcome back to Ozarks Tonight. Well, President Trump had a contentious interview with Chris Wallace of Fox News over the weekend. In that interview, Wallace pushed the president on many things, including his administration's response to COVID-19, the economy, and his bid for re-election. So tonight, we're taking a look at what the president needs to do with around 100 days until the election and what he can't do if he wants to spend the next 4 years in the White House. I want to welcome in our political analyst, Dr. Brian Calfano. Brian, it's good to have you along as always. So what does the president need to do right now to improve his chances in November?
Well, hey, John, I think the first thing he'd say he has to do is not talk to Chris Wallace anymore. But, you know, before we get into the specifics about Trump and his administration, I really hope folks took a look at that Wallace interview, especially those who are critical of Fox News and they say, you know, our affiliate, Ozarks Fox, is, you know, in the tank for a particular side and all of this. I mean, there are credible and seasoned journalists working for Fox News, and Chris Wallace is at the top of that list. No matter what your politics happen to be and whatever your view is of the president or Joe Biden or anybody else, there are legitimate journalists working at Fox. And I think the president, if he didn't realize that before, realizes that now. He may have been used to a lot of the more friendly environments that Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and other of the opinion hosts on Fox News Channel tend to provide for him during interviews. But this thing with Wallace was really, I think, the president looking a lot like he's just not interested in talking about the work that his administration does. And I think this is important to kind of get back around to the beginning of your question, which is what does the president have to do? What does he need to do in the last 100 days before this election happens? He needs to really be a better spokesperson for his administration, because it is not the case that the administration is sitting on its hands in dealing with COVID and in dealing with the economy. Now, people may have criticisms about the CDC and about Health and Human Services and about Tony Fauci and about other administration officials. But the administration has worked and continues to work on initiatives like this Project Lightspeed, or Warp Speed, I should say, which is even better than Lightspeed because it's faster if you follow Star Trek, I guess. And the idea being that we're going to get to a vaccine for COVID soon, sooner than even the record. We might be getting to a vaccine in 2021, which is amazing. And a lot of that is spurred on by work that the administration has done. But John, there's a disconnect between the work the administration has done on coronavirus, a lot of it headed up by Vice President Mike Pence, and the way the president tends to present this in his interviews. Seems disinterested, wants to argue over things about how he's been right and how, you know, him not taking responsibility or talking about COVID disappearing is eventually going to be proven correct. Well, those are kind of bizarre things to say and to talk about in the midst of a pandemic where we see nothing but an increase in the number of cases and an increase in those who are in ICU beds. So he's not doing a good job selling his administration.
One of the other things that Chris Wallace pressed the president on in that interview, he released a new Fox News poll that showed the former vice president at 49%, President Trump at 41% for people's likely choice for president coming up in November. And of course, the president, his common retort to when he sees a poll come out, he says, you know, the poll's not real. You know, don't believe it. We have our own polls here at the White House that show us ahead. We've all heard that over and over. What can you tell us, you know, 100 days out from the election? How much stock and how much faith do you put in polling at this point? What can you see? What can you not see from those from the polls that have been released so far? Just so folks at home can kind of understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, well, the first thing is keep in mind that any poll is a snapshot of a point in time. And if there are events that happen right after the poll was in the field, well, they may have changed the view that folks have of the individual, of the candidate in this case, of the issue. So polls are time-bound. The other thing is that right now, those polls do tell us something, John. They tell us that a lot of Americans are not happy with President Trump's performance, most specifically in regard to COVID-19 and the coronavirus response. Does this set of polls that look bad for President Trump right now vis-a-vis Joe Biden tell us who's going to win the election? Yeah, I mean, people are putting stock in the polls to try to predict, but I think it's still a bit too early to, if you're on the Biden team side, get really excited by these numbers. I know historically Biden has a bit of a lead over an incumbent president, but by the same token, We don't have the sort of standard or traditional presidential politics campaign year. The last time we were in a pandemic having a presidential election would have been, I guess it was 1920, right? So the point here being that we really don't have a good sense of how these kinds of things work in a pandemic, polling especially, because there wasn't modern polling back in 1920. Now, what do we get from these polls? As I said, we get a sense of President Trump's job approval rating. But as soon as you get Joe Biden, who has to go out on debate stages with President Trump, or has to do more sort of public appearances, as modified as they might be. So he's still in some studio somewhere, but he's doing a lot more appearances that get a good amount of press attention. And he's asked hard questions by reporters about what he's going to do differently than President Trump on some of these pressing issues. Biden, being Biden, not the greatest candidate. Again, this is his third time running for president. Remember that. Biden does not always present himself in the best way verbally. That will begin to have an eroding effect on his lead if he's not careful. And with 100 days to go, I think there's just way too much time for this race to have situations occur where those numbers tighten up. And by the time we get to election night, you're looking at a neck-and-neck race.
Well, 100 days, a lot can surely happen in that time period, Brian, as you know. Our political analyst, Dr. Brian Calfano. Brian, thanks for coming on the show tonight. We'll be back with more Ozarks Tonight right after this.